Okay, we've hit the top of the hour. I'm sure some more people will be joining over the next few minutes, but I think we can make a start on some of the administrative of the meeting just while we get going. Basically, this is the Quic working group meeting at IETF 111. Thank you for joining us. Present are Matt Joris and I, and Lars has just appeared. Hello, Lars, as your lovely co-chairs of the Quic working group for this 2-hour meeting session. As usual, we don't need to do blue sheets today because Meet Echo will cover that problem for us. We've had one volunteer to help take minutes, and that's Robin Marks, but Robin will be presenting at later on during this meeting. So if we could get someone to help out with the minute taking, that would be fabulous. We will need to do that, otherwise we won't be able to proceed. There's some important questions in Robin's slides as well, so having a record of those things is going to be very useful. What else is there to say? We have a very busy agenda. As you can see, we've got it up here. We can bash that in a moment, but just to say that most of these presentations will be, half and half, so 5 minutes plus 5 minutes for time for discussion. We'll try and maintain that as much as possible. I had a note from Martin Thompson before the meeting. He's not going to be able to make it. We'll touch briefly on the quick greasing bit, but probably won't dive into much discussion there. And that might give us time for some of the additional, as time permits, questions presentations that we have. It's always important to note the note well. So if you're not familiar with our policies around IETF participation and contributions, please take a moment to familiarize yourself with these things. Just listing our expectations for how you participate here. So yeah, it's a brilliant thing. Go and read up if you're not familiar, but these are the terms under which we engage in this meeting and other IETF venues. Oops, that's the wrong thing, wrong window. So we are trying out Meet Echo's new feature here today that you may have seen in some of the sessions yesterday that will allow us to upload presentations into Meet Echo and have the presenters drive them themselves. Presenters, if you'd like to make use of that feature, we are available to do that. But if not, if you would like one of the chairs, i.e. me, to drive that on your case, that's fine as well. Just let me know. I can do the screen share at the same time. I don't know if any of my co-chairs have anything else they'd like to add during this first few minutes. Let's see a shake of the head from Matt. Lars?
I have two quick things. One is that
you're on mute, Lars.
Am I? Can you hear me now?
No, you're not.
Still can't hear you.
All right. Well,
we can hear you. Lars, we can hear you.
Lars. Hear him.
Okay. So two quick things. One is that I hope to not be chair of Quic anymore before this meeting ends, as soon as Sahid presses the button in the data tracker. It was a fun ride, but we have 2 chairs, we don't need 3, and I have other things to do now, and the group's in great hands, so it's been fun. Second thing is we typically had a interrupt report that we took out because I don't think there was much interrupt happening last week. But I want to mention one interrupt related thing, and that is Martin Seaman runs this great quick interrupt runner tool, which seems to run out of disk space, both on his server and on GitHub. So if anybody can get him GitHub credits and or more storage space for his virtual instance, or he will gladly move it, I think, to whatever cloud provider wants to host it. And I think we're open to put a logo on that page too. So consider this like an ad, and contact Martin Seaman or the chairs if you're willing to help with this. Thank you.
Lucas, are you alive?
I don't know if we lost him. Okay, he was doing stuff.
So hello, I guess I can just start, right? I assume if I get no feedback, means everybody can hear me.
Go ahead, thank you.
So this is a very quick update just on the applicability and manageability statement. Basically, they are ready to go. You can go to the next slide, which I can't see yet. But the story on the next slide is that we had 2 working group last calls, one in April and one later on. We did a bunch of updates after each of these working group last calls. Because we had so many updates after the first one, we did a second one. After the second one, we still had a few updates, but like not as fundamental stuff as it was with the first one. And I just run you quickly through that so everybody's on the same page. And then I have one more thing I want to discuss. Now I really would need to see the next slide.
Control it? I thought you were supposed to be able to control it.
I think Lucas is sharing. I think he's just sharing his screen. I can't do anything.
I don't think so.
And
It's in the presentation mode for this shared slides, but I can't control it either.
Yeah, then Lucas is maybe presenting. But okay, now it's gone. Maybe we lost him completely.
Yeah, I don't see him. It says offline in the participant list.
Okay, so he just disappeared.
Do you have a copy, Miriam, that you can share from your screen?
I can just share them from the proceedings if somebody allows me to do it. I just hit the share button.
Okay. You can also just click the Ask to Share Slides button, and then it'll just share them through Meet Echo, and then you can control it.
Yeah, that's where we are right now, right? Hopefully. Okay. So now we go to the next slide. Yeah, but I already told you this. We had 2 working group last calls, and there's one new issue I want to discuss with you. Okay, so applicability statement, just very quickly. I think since the last working group last call, we had 3 PRs, which actually did change a little bit the content and not only were editorial fixes or clarifications. So we had a bunch of discussion about the H3 LLPN token. And so we have some additional text now that says, this is what we do right now, but it's just like how we do it. And it's all open for future versions, how we do that. Then we had some more guidance on use of DSCP, slightly more text, not really any content change, but like being more clear about things, hopefully now. And then we had like a very short section about egg frequency, and there was a lot of discussion if this belongs in the document or not. So now we actually try to give guidance that might be useful for a lot of people that want to use Quic, and now everybody was okay with the text that we have in the document. So this is also something. Okay, and then on the manageability statement, we had even less things. There were some clarifications about the guidance about PMTUD, and there was quite some edits about NSI parsing because we now we removed the whole appendix which talks about old Quic versions. That's not relevant anymore, and we clarified a couple of points which were really not correct. So I think those things are all resolved. Thank you, everybody who contributed. There's David, Ian, Martin, Gori, and so on. Really, really helpful, really good discussion. Thank you. So now, since the working group last call, we actually got one new PR. So this was an issue that was raised by Mark on the mailing list about usage of source ports because some of the system ports can be blocked. So there was the idea to add some guidance here to try to avoid using these ports. There is a PR for it. We can probably still merge it on. The document was supposed to be ready to go for AD review, but it's still in the working group, so we can still do changes. But I really have the question, if this is really Quic specific, does it belong in this document? Mark also raised this issue on the TSU working group mailing list where a lot of discussion is going on still. So maybe a more general document makes sense. And then the second question is also, so the first question is, should we add it to this document? And the second question is also, should we add something to the manageability document about net handlings, and net should also avoid these ports. But again, I think it's very general guidance and not specifically important, or like not specific to Quic only. So I would need some more feedback here. And I copied the text from the proposed PR here, but it's probably hard to read, so better you click on the PR yourself. Any feedback? And there's Mark.
I think we should do this.
It was pretty clear. Martin?
At this, what is likely to happen is that these ports will be selected and they won't work. Not because of any high, principled position, just because, well, some people just have to block these ports because of the nature of these services. So documenting it at least means that clients won't pick them deliberately. And maybe it'll mean that those devices that do network address translation won't pick them either. We can at least hope on that part. I don't think we'll ever be able to guarantee it.
So because that was also your proposal in the discussion, do you propose to also add something to the manageability statement as well?
It needs to be somewhere, but I don't know that it needs to be everywhere.
I mean, I think I agree about the point that this PR is making. It's just the question if this is really belonging into a Quic document or actually should be a more general document somewhere else. But probably it doesn't hurt to have it here. So, okay, next one, Thomas. You have to unmute yourself.
Thomas, Thomas, you need to start sending audio and video.
No, he disappeared. Okay, Lars.
Yeah, so as an individual and not as a chair, so I think I agree with Mark and Martin that this seems, I mean, yes, there's been a lot of UDP traffic in the past, but there's going to be a whole lot more UDP Quic traffic in the future, and these problems are going to be hit. And documenting this seems fine. If somebody feels like they want to work on a broader document, that's fine too. We could put text in there that says, the IETF might update this guidance and you should go search for, an IRC in this space somewhere else. But I think putting this in the document seems like a pragmatic way forward for an issue that's probably going to hit a bunch of traffic.
Mark.
Of my hand there, but yeah, I think this is, yes, it is in strictly speaking general guidance, but it is directly applicable to the deployment of Quic, and that's the scope of this document. So whether or not something happens elsewhere and whether or not something happens elsewhere is still not clear, because I've raised a discussion of this in the transport area working group, and there seem to be a few folks who are amenable to the idea and supportive of the need to do something here, and perhaps one person who is not, which is, as I understand it, a not uncommon pattern in the IETF. So we don't know what's going to happen there. And I'm fine with Martin's suggestion to broaden the scope a little bit and maybe put the manageability. We'll figure that out.
So do you plan to write a document for TSM working group? But because even if you have a draft,
I'd really rather not.
We could refer to it. Okay, got it.
But if need be,
I'm just asking
I'm
about your
hoping
plans.
someone else will take it. Sure. We'll see.
Okay. Jana.
Yes, I'm not opposed to having this in the document, but I would. This is not in scope. It's not work for us to do, but this I think also potentially belongs in an update to 8085, which we do reference in the Quic document. So if we had it in there, we wouldn't have to do this in Quic. So a forward-looking point perhaps to Lars. I don't know, the authors of 8085 unfortunately are stuck with that, but I don't know if you're stuck with that. Anyways. just a note that they should go into 8085 as well.
Roberto?
I believe that we should do it. It makes sense to do it in the context of this working group because Quic will definitely run into these problems. If it has broader scope, wonderful, but that doesn't change the fact that it will run into, Quic will run into these problems.
Okay, that's pretty clear. I will leave the PR open for a few more days so people can have a look and comment if they want to. Okay, and then the final question I have is, there was also another discussion on the mailing list recently where people talked about privacy concerns where the server might be able to link different connections through resumption or connection migration, knowing that after migration, the same IP address, different IP address is the same client, right? And I think the question was there, like, if you care about privacy, maybe you should actually reconnect to avoid this linkability. So that's something that could have been discussed in the transport document. It's not in there. We still have a chance to add something to the applicability draft if people want to do that. There's no PR yet. I just want to bring it up. Last chance, now or never. Any thoughts? Martin?
The discussion of this is in the TLS document. It's pretty clear, and I don't think we need to repeat it.
Okay. Then we have Christian.
Worthwhile to have at least a notice of that, because the discussion in the transport document is very brief. I mean, I think these points come from Stefan Bortsmeyer pointing out the issue, and it's worth having the issue at least documented somewhere in a more explicit way than it is in the transport document.
So, I mean, about the point about TLS, actually, so this is about session resumption is about TLS, but having the same issue or similar issue with migration is something we don't mention anyway, I think, at the moment.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
I think
you're right.
It would be easy to add like 2 or 3 sentences to the applicability statement if people want that.
And I think that would be a good idea.
So, except Christian, you want to do it, I would propose a short PR and then send it to the mailing list, and then people can have another look at it, and then hopefully we can close that loop in a few days. Sound
Okay.
good?
Yes.
Looking at the chairs as well. Maybe they cannot. Okay. Then I'm actually done here. That's it. We're done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Miria. That's good. We're kind of staying on track with timing, so I just encourage people to try and keep comments short as possible, and presenters to keep doing good work. Follow Miria's lead. Who's presenting? Miria, would you like to start presenting as well? Brilliant. Up next, we've got Datagram. I think, Tommy, you wanted me to drive this one remotely. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I can do it in case your computer goes away again. Let me try. All right. Can you see that? Great.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll give a quick update on datagrams. There's hopefully not too much to say here. We're getting pretty far along. So currently we're on the draft 03 version for the working group draft. We now have, I think, many different implementations and early deployments beyond some experimental stuff. We're starting to see some of the work in Mask get deployed in some production environments. So we have a lot more usage of datagrams going on now. So they're just getting fairly heavily exercised. I think talking to the other editors, we think it should be ready for a working group last call with the next revision once we are able to cut that after this meeting. We'd of course love to hear the chair's input on that, but that's what I want to focus on. How do we kind of get this out the door? In the most recent revisions, I just want to highlight a couple of the updates that are relevant. There was discussion around the transport parameter. We ended up putting in the definition that if your max datagram frame size is 0, it indicates that you do not support datagrams, and so it means you can default that to 0, and that means you won't support it, and that's not going to mess up any kind of default implementations. We used to have some description also of the H3 datagram approach. We have removed that since that is undergoing more churn and discussion, and we don't really strictly need to have that, and so we don't want to tie ourselves to the work going on in Mask, and we can let that kind of evolve on its own. And we split out a section for talking about how you can do multiplexing, just to have more generic guidance on different ways application protocols could approach using the datagram frame. We also had some clarifications around ACK handling, specifically giving extra guidance and assurance that just because you receive an ACK for a datagram frame, that does not mean that the application on the other end processed it. So it is not a replacement for end-to-end application signals. So there's essentially very, very few issues open. One is just kind of a wording thing. There's another one that I believe Mike Bishop had opened. That's this one. I believe it's something we don't need to do anything in this draft for, but we'd like to confirm with the group. Essentially, it's talking about the fact that Datagram does not define any application format, and there was a suggestion to say, what should implementation do if it starts receiving datagrams and it doesn't know what they mean? From our perspective, I think it's very equivalent to the fact that if you receive stream data and you haven't defined what your application is, you may not know what to do with that. And that really is just a problem for the application protocol running on top. That's why H3 is defining its definition of datagrams. So I'd like to hear if people think we should say anything about this in this document. Maybe there's a suggestion on the issue, I think, that maybe we could say something in another document like applicability or something like that to talk about how you use the different features like streams and datagrams within Quic. So any thoughts? Lucas.
Hello. Just as an individual here, I think a way you might be able to weasel out of this thing is to say something like in the applicability document that any mechanism in Quic that is designed to carry application data might have this kind of problem, and trying to get away from mentioning specific extensions. Yes, we have streams, they're in the core spec. Yes, we have datagrams, they're an extension. We don't want to tie up applicability with every new extension that might be coming along, kind of thing. And I know that's very unlikely right now, but having something generic and abstract might just help us have this common rule for everything that makes sense. So that's all I can say.
Thank you. Sounds good. Miriam?
I did add a section about datagrams in the applicability statement, and I think it does talk about this works different than streams. I'm not sure what else you would want to add there, but if it's only 3 words, right, we can probably still add it.
Okay. So maybe we can kind of reference this issue over to applicability and wordsmith it there.
Yeah, maybe review the text we have. I mean, I think you reviewed the text we have there at some point, but maybe review it again and see what's missing. That would be interesting to know.
Okay. All right. Jana?
Thank you. I'm not sure. So if I was to compare datagrams with stream frames, for example, which have slightly different semantic in terms of what they offer, but ultimately they offer a particular service to the application. We don't go out of our way to describe exactly what application format or what application uses of streams are. So in much the same way, it seems to me that datagrams are a mechanism. The application is the one that's ultimately setting up the transport connection. And if the application doesn't know what to do with datagrams, it shouldn't be sending datagrams. And it's a matter for the application to handle rather than for the transport to specify. That's my sense. So I don't think there's anything that we need to do here, basically.
Sounds good. Martin?
Request that you specifically don't do anything. If you're defining a protocol, you should define the protocol. And if you're speaking a protocol, you should speak the protocol. This is a bit weird. Just stop. And ship it.
Yep. We intend to. Kazuo.
Assuming that we want to write something somewhere, I'm not sure if writing that in applicability document is sufficient, because if I tend to believe that we should have some RFC 2119 or uppercase words saying what the implementation should do, and therefore I think that delegating, we should use a 2119 word to delegate the responsibility to the applications using the datagram frames. Then I tend to believe that that requirement should be in this document.
Okay. Roberta?
The interesting thing about datagrams is that datagrams are almost entirely semantic free from the application side. And that means that there's really only two applicability problems. One is routing the datagram to the right place, and the other one is doing the business logic. I think talking about the former makes sense, right? Talking about the latter is obviously futile. So, saying that this is what you must do probably is sufficient. If we need to talk about routing, talk about routing. Anything other than that is not likely to actually be useful.
All right. So my general sense is that there's, nothing particular to say here. So I would be inclined to probably close this issue, and we can confirm that on that GitHub issue. That sounds good. All right. That's all I had for slides. So I guess, we'll cut a new version when we have all of our issues, NPRs closed. And then chairs, do you think it'll be good to ask all?
Yeah, I think so. We've done a lot of work in here, and there's some implementations, interop, etc. So thanks to the editors for the edits. We'll confirm the consensus on the list for what to do with this issue. But we have dependencies on this document in other working groups. The sooner we can get this done, the better. So
sounds good. Thank you.
Next up, we have David with the version negotiation document. How would you like to run the slides, David?
I'll ask to share slides that I control it myself, if that's all right.
You are in control. Do not abuse it.
Oh, no promises there. All right, are the slides coming in fine? Cool. All right. Good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night, everyone. I'm David Skenazy, and here to talk about the version negotiation draft. So, and my fellow co-author Ecker is also in the audience here somewhere. Kind of a quick recap. So I'm not going to read through the beginning of this. This was already in the past few presentations. we had VN early on in Quic. Then we realized that it was harder than we thought, so we removed it. And then we said, well, we still need this, so let's publish it as an extension to Quic as opposed to something that's in RC 9000. So folks agreed, we adopted that as a working group, and then there was a lot of discussion that the solution proposed was too complicated. So we had an interim where we talked about how things were complicated. And Martin Thompson stepped up and actually provided a proposal that was less complicated and still had the same feature set, which was great. So we wrote up that on PRs, talked back and forth, and the latest draft, 04, has the simplified design in it. So I'm going to go through today and kind of go through what changed. So as a quick high-level view, if you haven't been paying attention, RC 9000 just says that if you receive a VN packet, you abort the connections. You can't really, by default, with just that, use it for VN. So you need something. That's not a problem for our main deployment, which is H3, because you know the versions in alt service. You're never going to use VN in practice. But Quic being general purpose, we want this to work. So this is why we're actually writing this document. And one requirement that we thought would be really useful was that in some cases, it would be great to be able to do VN without burning a round trip, because Quic and applications using Quic really care about latency. Burning time on a round trip is sad. So that's the constraints we're working with. So the draft defines two different kinds of version negotiation. One called incompatible version negotiation. This one works between any two Quic versions in existence and relies on, so when the client starts, the server replies with a VN packet, and then the client restarts with a different version. And then the second kind is compatible version negotiation, which requires two versions to be compatible. So that doesn't work with absolutely every version. And it allows the server to immediately reply with the compatible version without having to burn a round trip for the VN in the first flight. But what does compatible mean? For which versions can you do this? So the idea is conceptually that the server can receive a first flight with version A, and it can convert it to a first flight with version B, and then process that and then reply with version B. So one important note is that it's not bijective, meaning that it's possible that one version you can convert to another, but not the other way around. And it's also true that it's not, like if a version is compatible, maybe some first flights aren't, if, for example, you're using a feature that isn't available in the other version, so you couldn't convert. So how do we get all this to work? And this is the main part that has changed since the previous IETF. So during the handshake, you send something called handshake version information, which is kind of an invariant between all Quic versions. And the property that it needs is that it's exchanged during the handshake in a way that it's that is integrity protected. So in Quic, we use transport parameters because those are part of the TLS transcript. So if they're not necessarily encrypted, but if they're modified by an attacker, the handshake will fail. And one of the goals here is to prevent downgrade attack, meaning that an on-path attacker that sends a evilly crafted VM packet can't cause the client and server to use a version that the attacker chooses instead of the client and server choosing. So what is its format? It's pretty darn simple. It has one version, which is the chosen version, and then a list of other versions. For the client, it's compatible versions. So on the case of the client, it says, hey, I'm trying to handshake with version A, and here are the compatible ones that we can switch to if you'd like. And then on the server side, it says, here, let's use either the version you told me or a compatible one that we switched to. And by the way, here are the ones I support. So just very quickly to add a slide in the slides, this is what it looked like before. So this is probably the simplest way to show that things have gotten a lot simpler. Thanks, Martin. And so one slight tweak that we went back and forth on this, on what does it mean for the server to support versions? And so if conceptually, the versions you support are pretty simple. It's the ones that you can speak quick with, and the one that you sent in your VN packet, and the ones you sent, you being the server, and the ones you sent in handshake version information. But it turns out that as you know, if you're adding a version, if you flip these three sets at once, you could end up with some connections failing. Let's say, for example, you remove a version, but between the time you've sent a VN packet with that version and the time the client reconnects, that could cause a connection failure. So we found a kind of three-step algorithm in the spec, which is kind of pretty simple. It separates this set of supported versions into three newly named sets. One is acceptable versions, which is if I receive an initial for this version, I'll use that I can use that version. I like it right now. Offered versions is if I send you a VN packet, these are the ones I will send. And then fully deployed versions are the ones the server will send in the handshake version information for downgrade prevention. And conceptually, all you need to do is you add it to the if you're adding a version, you add it to the first one, you wait a minute, you add it to the second one, you wait a minute, you add it to the third. That means you don't have things in flight as you do, and that solves these problems, and same in the other direction if you're removing. This is a should. Like at Google, we're not planning on doing this. We just do everything at once, and every time we add or remove a new Quic version, we get a huge spike in user connection failures. Meh. Just use TCP, it's fine, we don't care. It's not worth the work. So we have an algorithm for fixing that, but it's a should in the spec. How does downgrade protection work? So one is, and this one's, that's already in RFC 9000, if memory serves, which is if you receive a VN packet for the version you tried, then that's clearly wrong. So drop that. And then the other one is if the client has reacted to a version negotiation packet, it needs to double check the supported versions from handshake version information. So the way it does that is the client already has an algorithm somewhere to go from a set of server provided versions to a version that it wants to use. So that's the algorithm that it ran when it received the VN packet. And all we're saying is when you receive the handshake version information, which this one is integrity protected, rerun the algorithm and make sure you land on the same one. We initially had some other ways of defining this, but we found that this one was the simplest one to implement and reason about as well, and allows us more flexibility in how to, any way like the clients want to have this algorithm behave. You know, unless they're choosing randomly, in which case they'll have a problem, but perhaps you shouldn't be doing that. And yes, so there's like, that's about it for the changes. There was one issue that I just wanted to get some folks' thought on. When the client offers its list of compatible versions, the draft currently says that they're sorted by preference. So the client can tell the server which one it would prefer the server use. That's not entirely necessary because the server is not required to do this. So Martin was saying maybe we don't need it to be sorted. What do people think? Do we care? Roberto.
Server's going to do what server's going to do.
So you cut off at the beginning. Can you repeat the start of that?
I said, is this required? You can put it in there. It'll likely have zero effect. It doesn't matter. Server's going to do what server's going to do. If we come up with something better than that, the clients and the servers will work together. It'll happen organically. I don't think we need to interrupt on it right now.
Cool. Thanks. Jana?
Hey, I agree with Roberto that server's going to do what server's going to do, but this is information from the client to the server so that the server can do what it does slightly better, perhaps. I don't have a strong opinion here, but if we can embed this information, we found in the past that it could be useful, this preference information. So if it's not at much cost, I think it's worth putting it in there.
Cool. Thanks, Jana. Ecker?
We're just registering our opinions now. We might as well take a hum, but I concur with Jana that this is useful information. It is essentially no effort whatsoever for the client to put them in order, and so we ought to do it.
Cool. Thanks, Martin.
is that you then have to repeat the selected version. And that gets a little awkward.
Sorry, you cut off at the beginning. The microphone always takes a second to do the thing.
I won't say anything about that. The only problem with putting them in order is that then you're forced to put the selected version into order, because the selected version is not necessarily the most preferred version in all cases. So I would prefer not to sort at all and let the server do what the server going to do. After all, it is the server's choice when it comes to selecting between compatible versions, and the client's choice, well, that all depends on what's in the VN packet, not what's in this protocol.
Cool, that also makes sense. That's a good point. Chairs, how would you feel about doing a hum so we get a feel? Because it sounds like people have preferences, but no one wants to die on any hills. So it could be nice to just get a feel for the room, and if they're pick that direction, if that sounds good.
If I could jump in for
John,
a moment,
are you back in the queue?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
a clarification question before a hum is taken. So I jumped in there on what Martin just said. I didn't understand that. David, if you did understand what
let me add to that. So let's say, for example, that Quic v2 comes out and Quic v1 and Quic v2 are compatible because we made some very small changes to them. I can see that being very likely. But right when Quic v2 comes out, let's say the client supports 1 and 2, and it prefers 2 because it's newer, shinier, better, all the things. But 2 just came out, and there are very few servers out there that support 2, but a lot more that support 1. So it's reasonable for the client to use 1 first, even though it prefers 2, because that way, if the server only supports 1, boom, with no added route trip, it speaks 1. And if the server speaks 2, it'll do a compatible upgrade and it'll immediately speaks 2. Whereas if the client started with 2 and the server has never heard of 2, that'll fail. And so therefore, you need to be able to encode in the client's supported versions list, in the client's compatible versions list, where the one that it tried, so in this case, 1 is encoded, because you can't assume that it's at the top. So in this case, you would say, my chosen version is 1, and my compatible versions are 2 and 1. So you would have to send 2 versions, whereas in MT's proposal, where you don't have the ordering, you can remove that and just say, I chose 1, and by the way, I'm compatible with 2. I don't need to repeat 1 because there's no ordering. Does that help?
Yes. So you're saying that it makes the chosen version more explicit, which again is a good thing in my book, but that's what I'm hearing.
So
cool,
I opened
thanks.
a thing so people can we don't hum, we raise hands, and we don't vote.
Where is it on the top right show of hands tool? It's in yellow. Thanks.
Yeah, it looks like a little bar chart if anyone is trying to find it in the top right of the screen.
So should the client sort versions by preference? I suspect raise hand means yes, and do not raise hand means no.
Yeah.
All right. Martin? Oh, get more Martin. All right, I think the results have come in. Oh, no, still more.
Yeah, you've got 10 more seconds, folks. Can't run a poll forever. I think we can call it there. So for the record, the figures I'm seeing is that for the question, should the client sort versions by preference, 30 have raised their hand in support. There we go. And 9 have not raised their hand, not in support.
Yeah, we have 150
So it's
people in the room at the moment, so it's only
yeah.
about 20 to 25%.
Yeah, and so 100 people who don't care. So my intuition there is to use this result to say, okay, let's keep it in. Can everyone live with that? And by keep it in, I mean keep the preference ordering the way it is in the draft today.
That sounds like a good thing to do, David. I think we could put it in the issue, then take it to the list for confirmed consensus.
Sounds good. Chairs, can you add a comment on the issue to that regard?
Yeah.
Thank you. So that was the only issue that I wanted to highlight today. Does anyone have other questions or things they want to chat about on version negotiation?
We're really at time here, so I want to say thanks, David. I think if people do have any further comments or questions, please just take them to the list, take them to the issue tracker, and we have the process to run there. So thanks again.
Sounds good. We have some number of issues, a lot of which are editorial, so the editors will do a pass to kind of clean that up, and ideally our next revision after that will bring it back, and if there aren't any more issues, we will try to wrap it up and ask for the working group last call as well. All right, thanks everyone.
All right, this is potentially very quick. Next slide, please. Not much has happened, frankly, since 110. Honestly, this is kind of stuck in certain ways. There are a few issues that I can kind of run down with the people who care about them. But ultimately, the issue is implementations. I went ahead and implemented the load balancer side and retry service side of the spec because I figured there are lots of servers. And in practice, no servers have implemented this. Part of this is because address migration is relatively low on people's feature priority list, and without address migration, the load balancer bit doesn't matter. So I've been sort of waiting for those servers to show up, and if you have one, by all means, I'm ready to interop at any time. So we can. The other thing going on is there are a few kind of new use cases and stuff dribbling in that sort of fit in this framework, and I'll discuss the only one that's come up in the last quarter. But you know, there's 3 paths forward with this. I can just kind of take executive action here and just grind through the issues and make a lot of decisions without a lot of input because people don't really care, and just get this thing done and ship it. Or we can wait around for implementations, which is the position we're in now. We might speed things up by splitting the retry service stuff from the load balancer stuff because they're not really all that related. I don't have a strong opinion about that. Next slide. And to give an example of the kind of sort of what I could uncharitably call mission creep is we got a proposal from Ant Financial, which has been pretty involved in the retry service stuff, to have stateless retry offload. Pardon me, stateless reset offload. Oh, man, I always confuse those and mix it up on the slide. So ignore what the slide says. Stateless reset offload. Many of you remember that if a server is down, or sorry, if a server goes down and loses state and then receives a sort of random packet, it can send the stateless reset packet. And the idea is that you have a box in front of your servers, you know the server's down for maintenance, and you'll send these stateless resets. I personally do not find this use case compelling. There's an issue on it. I would welcome your input on it. Right. Okay. Can you return to the previous slide? So that's it. I don't know if anyone has any opinions, strong or otherwise, about how we should move forward with this document, or if they personally have a server that they're getting ready to implement the server bit of this. But that's all I've got. Thanks. There's a Jabber question. Does the stateless reset Oracle problem, is this solvable? And it's been a couple months. I don't remember the details, but the answer is yes.
Okay, so I am hearing mass indifference to how we move forward here, and not a lot of urgency on implementing this. So I think this will remain pretty much frozen and stuck for at least a little while. If people are just never going to do address migration as for the foreseeable future, that would be good information as well. We could do it on the list, but I think I'm done here. Thanks.
Christian?
We can't hear you, Christian.
In a private comment to Martin before, I think there is a possibility with proper load balancing, and specifically with the fact that the server ID is encoded somehow in the connection ID. There's a possibility to almost guarantee that a retry goes back, and at a resumption goes back to the same server in the pool. By basically just remembering the connection ID offered in a previous session. And if one does that, there is a potential benefit that if a resumption goes to the same server, you can make a lot of assumptions about not needing, for example, to encode the tickets using STEC, which would be a major security benefit. So I wonder if there is interest in pursuing something like that.
Well, I think the most straightforward way to do it would be to use new connection ID. So to use the new connection IDs provided in the previous connection when you reconnect. So I think there's no text about that, but it's certainly something.
No, Martin. The point is not whether it's hard to do. Yes, it is doable.
Yeah.
The point is whether the server can assume that enough clients will do it, that they can go to a stackless deployment.
Yeah, I guess I should respond. I don't have any strong feeling about one or the other. It's another example, kind of one of the lateral ways in which we can expand this, but I'm concerned this keeps expanding while not actually getting any further closer to completion.
No, that's true. It's not. I am using the queue there. It's kind of related to your draft, but it's fully independent.
Mm-hmm. Roberto?
Stop.
So I think what you're really talking about here is solving the session problem, one way or another, from some definition of a session, right? We have the IDs that we use that define the quick connection session, right? And then we've been adding extensions so that, as interpreted through load balancers, et cetera, that session could continue past certain state changes, right? There are other state changes that are interesting for this problem space of addressing a session. Sadly, I don't see a whole lot of interest overall in folks in solving that problem right now. So I don't think it's all that surprising that you're not getting much interaction on it, because the problem is much larger than just that. And that problem is also not being discussed. That's it.
All right. If there's no one else in the queue, there's a lot of other stuff to talk about. So if people have thoughts about this they don't want to share, please email me. I may confer with the chairs offline about how to proceed, because I'm sensing a lot of indifference about all the details of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Next up is Robin to talk about Qlog. Robin, would you like me to present, or would you like to do it?
Yeah, I'd like to do it myself. I raised a slides request.
Oh, I missed that. I'll approve it. There we go. And a reminder for Watson, if you're listening, that now is your main chance to star and take over from Robin, to just fill out those notes. Thank you, Watson. Take it away, Robin.
Yeah, that would be nice. All right, everyone, welcome to Qlog update number 5341. In case you missed the memo, Qlog is now officially adopted in the working group, and we've done it in part of 3 different documents. The first one is what we call the main schema, which is more like a protocol agnostic document with some high-level metadata and also the serialization format that we use. And then we have 2 separate documents, one for Quic and one for H3 and QPAC, and those mainly define the events that you can log for these protocols. The idea being that sometime in the far distant future, we can add additional documents for other protocols that reuse the protocol main schema to keep Qlog workable across these things. Now, what I want to talk today most about is this serialization format and event schema. And just to make sure we're all on the same level, let's take a look at a simple example here of a very simple Qlog on the left, where we have some metadata on top, and then we have a list of events. And each event is quite simple. It has a timestamp, a name or an event type, if you will, and then some structured data that depends on the event. And most of the 2 protocol documents that we have, they look a bit like to the bottom right there. They define what type of events you should log and what they should look like, which fields they include, how those fields are named, what types they are, and so on. This is what I'm calling the schema, right? And if you start from just the schema on the bottom right there, you can imagine there are many different ways that you can actually serialize this into a concrete presentation. What we have on the left, of course, is a simple example of that using the JSON format, which is also the default that we use or have been using for Qlog. There is also a secondary format that we currently define, which is called new line delimited JSON. And this is mainly to work around one of the problems with JSON, is that it is very strict about closing all of the elements you open, or else you'll get parser errors. And this is kind of annoying if you are streaming events in a live implementation where you don't always have the option to properly close everything down. And so this is mainly added as a way to do a streaming Qlog option as well. So this is kind of what we have. This is now adopted, and now we need to move to what do we actually want to standardize about this? What do we keep? What do we add? What do we change, right? What is the scope of what we're going on? And so I want to talk about these 2 things mainly today. The first one is the serialization format. So the main reason I chose JSON at the beginning is because I think it's very, very flexible. It's also very well supported in most programming environments, and so it's easy for even novices to make tools to interpret Qlog logs. It's also textual, so we don't even need new tools. We can use existing text-based tools that people are using for existing logs, network logs, for the Qlogs as well. Now, there are also obvious downsides. One of the main ones is, of course, performance. JSON is not the most efficient of formats. And for this discussion specifically, ND-JSON, or really, as far as I can tell, not any type of streaming JSON, has actually been practically standardized, or at least not within the IETF at this point. Now, it's mainly the performance problems that have led to a lot of discussion in the past about maybe we should replace this with something else. Recently, we've talked a lot about using CBOR. There's even someone who brought up maybe doing something with PCAP and G. And I think we can all agree that we could bike shed on this and discuss the merits of these different formats for a couple more years to come. But I don't really think we want to do that. So I wanted to phrase this question in a slightly different way and kind of say, you know, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the issue actually here? Why do we need a standard? Do we need something, an interoperable logging format that makes it easy to create reusable tools? On top of that, is the lack of tools is that the main problem? Or is it the problem that none of you seem to figure out how to efficiently log stuff from your implementations? And the way I phrase that makes clear that, of course, I think it's the first. I think it's the lack of tools. And not the second. I think most of you have a very good idea of how to efficiently log. You're already doing this for many other things as well. So do we really want to define or put an emphasis on that? And this is kind of an unfair statement. It's a false dichotomy, right? Because choosing one does not necessarily preclude the other. You can do something tools based on an optimized format. But in my experience over these past few years working on this, it's that the more optimized formats make it more difficult to create tooling, reusable tooling, or at least have novices or newer people create these tools. Right, and there are other arguments, I think, for not choosing more complex formats above JSON, because some very scalable implementations have shown that JSON can, in fact, be used at a very large scale. Facebook, as I understand it, it's not optimal, but it's definitely workable. There are also several implementations that do a very good approach where they don't log QLog directly, they don't log JSON directly, they log their own custom binary format, or even something not related to QLog at all. And then they create a converter program to make that into something that QLog tools can understand, which I think is a perfectly valid approach. And let's be honest, I think people will keep on doing that even if we would switch to CBOR or PCAPNG or what have you. And finally, I think that QLog and JSON compresses very, very well, so that might alleviate some of the issues we have with JSON. And so the concrete proposal here, what I'm building up to is, what I would like to do is that we just say, okay, we're just going to stick with JSON, and then we're going to have something custom for a streaming option, maybe based on something existing, something new, I don't know, just to focus on that. And that doesn't mean that we can't switch to a more optimized format down the line, but that wouldn't be the main focus that we have at the beginning, right? So that's the first part, that's the streaming format. And then the second part I want to talk about is the event schema, right? What we have currently is mainly like 3 main categories of events in QLog. The first one are very close to the wire image. They mainly describe what's going in and out of the implementations. And then we have some additional events, of course, for things that are not on the wire, things that are mostly the internal state changes, let's say related to congestion control. And then crucially, there's a third category that I've called custom events. These are not in the spec at all, and this means that implementations are free to define their own events as they see fit. Of course, tools can't interpret what they don't know, but they can, for example, in QVIS we do that, they can, in some cases, display even events that they don't know to make them even usable in practice. Even in this case, for example, if someone had a typo in the event type, it still shows the event, it's still usable for knowing what's going on, right? Now, you might think that these 3 categories are enough, that this would cover all of the use cases, but we found some nuances in this over the years and working on this. For example, we have what is called the packets act event. And you might think this is exactly the same as logging the acknowledgement frame on the left, but there's a slight difference in that, of course, in Quic we can have duplicate acts that are repeated in multiple packets. Well, the packets act event is semantically different in that it only logs the newly act packets at specific time, which is of course core input for example, the loss detection algorithms there. So these are similar but not the same. And then we have a third one that is also related, which is called the frames processed event, where we basically just log the frames, the wire image of the frames that comes in, but without the packet headers. This is mainly to accommodate implementations that, for example, separate processing of the headers and the payloads, or that might, for example, want to aggregate a lot of frames across packets into a single event for easier processing. Again, something useful, but this kind of, to me, ties into something that Mark Nottingham talked about last time that I presented on QLog, where this is starting to look more like surfacing implementation details in the people doing the QLog, rather than actually focusing on the semantics and the events of the protocols themselves. And so the question is, do we really want that kind of event in there? And then very recently, we've had an even weirder proposal, where they said, you know, in my use case, I'm logging a lot of the same exact frame over and over again, especially stream and act frames. Can't I have like a template frame somewhere defined once, and then I only log the fields that have been changed over time to make it easier for me? Now, I'm personally not the biggest fan of this kind of proposal, but I do understand where this question is coming from, right? And that's kind of the problem. I think all of these things are useful, but I don't think we should or can support all of these. It would just get way too confusing, both for people trying to implement Qlog, which events should I be outputting now, but especially also for tools. Which events should I be looking for? How do I merge separate events that might tell me the same thing but slightly different? And also, how do I communicate to the user of the tool which events are actually being used to visualize this particular data, right? And so we need some way, I think, a design philosophy or a guideline to limit or to guide how we do these event definitions. And again, I have a concrete proposal for that. The idea is basically to stay as close to the wire image as possible, where possible, to just log what's going in and out, and mainly deviate from that for internal state events, like I said, for things like congestion control that you don't see on the wire, right? That's basically what we had in Qlog draft 00, the very first things, and also in 01. And then I'll propose we can deviate from this in a pragmatic way when it makes sense. For example, the packets act, for me, does make sense. That gives you a lot of extra information that you can use in some situations. Another thing that I would find is very interesting is for QPack, where currently we're only logging the pure wire image. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's still very difficult to parse to understand what's actually going on. So I would like to have some higher level events on there as well. But if we would follow this would mean that we do get rid of things like next slide, yeah. Things like the frames processed event, that we would scrap that, even though we have it now, to make things easier. This means that implementations that do want to split these things out or can't log these in the same point, they would have to move to like a custom Qlog or a partial Qlog or whatever you want, and then have to write a converter application to make it into a proper Qlog compatible with the tools. Again, this is something many people have already been doing, and I don't see this as a very big problem myself. So in summary, what we want to do is kind of get an idea of the scope of Qlog, where are we moving towards. And I propose keeping it relatively contained around what we already have and even a little bit less. I would like to stick with JSON and something custom for streaming, at least for now, and then also reduce the amount of events that we have. Now, these are only two of the main issues. We have maybe 50 more open, of which all the feedback is mostly welcome, definitely welcome. But what I think, why I'm bringing this to you today is that if we get some clear input on these two things, that will make a lot of the existing issues much easier to solve and to make progress on, if we can get your thoughts on this. So please come to the mic. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. Just before we hit the mic queue, I just want to interject as a chair. It's been, Qlog's a newly adopted document. It's been rumbling along for a while. People have been implementing this thing, but yeah, like Robin said, there's quite a few issues on that data on the GitHub repo that we'd like to start burning through, really. And these two questions aren't the only ones that will need to be answered, but the sooner we can come to some agreement on this, some rough consensus, the more we can move on. Just in case you missed it, Robin, during your presentation, there was a suggestion that RFC 7464 could be used as a streaming JSON format. So that might be something worth looking up and to consider in the discussion we're going to have now in the next 6 minutes or so. And with that, I'll butt back out of the queue. And
right, I'm in the queue. Shall I go ahead? Arno's running the queue. So very quickly, I think the way in which I've always thought about Qlog, and it's the reason that we wanted to standardize this in the Quic working group, was because it is, as some others have said on the chat as well, an interop format. And the interop is happening in this world, to me, between producers on the one side and consumers, which are tools on the other side. So to me, Qlog is the PCAP of Quic, or PCAP-NG of Quic for that matter. So if you have a format, basically, that whether you produce to directly or you produce through tools, it doesn't matter to me, because if you want to use the tools that are on the other side of the format, you go through this format. That is the value of QLog for me. And I like the principles that you outlined in the previous slide. And I think sticking to that makes a lot of sense. Sticking very close to the wire image is fundamental, it's primary. We need that. Everything else is additional useful information, and that is always a question of how many people care about it, how many people want that information, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the examples that you outlined and everything you said made complete sense to me, but I want to say that to me, QLog is always an intermediary format. So I wouldn't get moved by people who say, I can't produce this format directly from my server or my client. That's okay. They can produce an intermediate format, use a converter, go from there to QLog.
Fully agree. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, so this is Paul Hoffman. Definitely a lurker here in Quic. In fact, I only care about QLog at the moment. So I agree with Jana, the design philosophy stuff is super important. One thing in the current draft that gets very mixed up, though, is that it seems like QLog is either a logging format or a debugging format. And many of the choices that you made were, because it's mostly used for debugging, then you can expand some space here, or you can lose this or lose that. And I think the working group needs to determine that first, because a logging format needs to be much more efficient, needs to this and this and this if you're going to be keeping huge logs, even sampled logs. I mean, we're certainly hoping that Quic servers are spewing out gazillions of messages a moment. So once that gets a little bit more settled, I think a lot of these things will fall out. And that will also answer some of the things in the schema are very loose. In fact, like names are this way. Oh, except when they're this way. That's okay for a debugging format. That's absolutely not okay for a logging format. And then the last thing I'll say is I think that keeping it as a schema that is JSON-like or JSON-based is great, and I certainly would expect somebody to create a binary format that is inherently smaller, easier to deal with and such. CBOR would work just fine. I say that as somebody who's used CBOR for a while. It doesn't have to be the main one, it can be a side one, but that way, as that tooling that you're talking about comes up, there's an obvious platform for it. There's libraries for CBOR everywhere, there are for others as well. But then that way you can get it, because you can't compress JSON on the fly. You'll eat your entire CPU. So both of those desires could be held. So I certainly am willing to participate in this, but I would really like to know if it's meant to be logging or debugging. If it's debugging, I'll be much looser. Thanks.
Yeah, I like that. It obviously started mostly as a debugging format, right? And it evolves into logging. I hope maybe someone from Facebook can give a little bit more information on that, because they, as I understand it, do constant logging at their scale, even though it's sampled, which does seem to hold up with the current QLog thing. So I'm not sure if that comment of yours was mostly about the JSON aspect of it, or mostly about the types of events or the verbosity of the events we log.
Watson, do you want to step up?
My main interest in QLog is that I might have to look at them occasionally to figure out what the heck's going on. And I think that means keeping it close to the wire format so it's easy to compare what's happening at each end, and having additional annotations, if that would be helpful from implementations as an extensible thing, would also be very important. And that's probably more important than size and speed, because I'm just going to do this on connections that have trouble.
Cool. Matt, are you in the queue?
Yeah, so first off, I was just saying a general thing, speaking as an individual. I think it would be useful structurally to have the schema and the serialization specified separately, mostly because they are separate things. So So it gives us the flexibility to say down the road, have an arbitrary serialization. Whereas the schema, once we decide how we want to represent that best, can just be more, solidly and independently defined. On the serialization thing, I think that we should be very careful about prematurely trying to do any sort of compression. And the main reason I say that is because compression algorithms are very good at that, and people, when we're designing file formats, are not very good at this. I know we do a lot of like compression in Quic and related areas, but file compression is a different game, and like things that are streaming compression are a different thing. So probably the people that spend their lives researching that and doing that are going to do a better job than we are. And so to comment about the Facebook thing, yes, we log. We don't even do the ND-JSON. We just log JSON straight from our Quic connections, and that works. Could it be better and smaller? Yes, it could be a lot better and smaller, but just compressing that makes a huge difference because their compressors are fast, and QLog JSON is extremely compressible. But I think that like having a standard interchange format for like that's just JSON is totally where we should go, because that was the most agile way to represent it so that we can have as many tools as possible.
All right, thanks.
Cool. Jonna, can you keep it brief, please?
Lucas, did I get in my climb before you close it off? I'll just say
no, just be quick, please.
Okay, yep, very quick. I agree with what Matt said. I realized that I didn't actually answer the questions for the proposals that you have in the slide. I agree that having the JSON serialization is actually very useful. I routinely go through QLogs manually, and reading the file to be able to read the file is super helpful. And yeah, I think where it is good. I don't think that we need to add other formats unnecessarily.
Well, that's very clear. Thanks.
Yeah, we're at time for this presentation. I hope, Robin, you got some of the input that you're looking for. I know this is an important question that you would like answered in order to make progress. The sense I'm getting here is that JSON seems fine, and there might be some work to do on a streaming format that we can go away and do. If that's not the case, I encourage people to speak up on the list. We'll take this question to the list to try and confirm the consensus that we're feeling. Yeah, yeah, I think the important thing is that a JSON format for serialization doesn't prevent other things. If other people want to do other things, they can. So anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you, and we'll synchronize offline.
Thanks all.
So next up, we have Ian to talk about the ACT frequency draft, also a newly adopted document. The agenda did say Jana, so I got myself confused, but this will be Ian presenting. We've got 20 minutes for this, so take it.
Great. Thank you. Can you advance next slide? Can everyone hear me? Oh, cool. So we have a few PRs that are fairly straightforward, just like renames and such. There were a number of confusions around exactly what the fields meant, particularly because it was one peer sending a frame that modified the behavior of the other peer. And so we attempted to pick new names that are a little bit less confusing than the old names. So we intend to merge these fairly soon because we think they're pretty minor changes, and we encourage people to take a look. Next slide. Oop. Is the next? Oh, please just take a moment. So Martin Thompson rightly suggested that having a special value that's completely invalid is sort of silly. And so we have taken this suggestion and adjust the meaning of the field by 1, which this changes 0 from being an invalid value to meaning basically send an acknowledgement immediately as soon as you receive the packet. So there's an outstanding PR for this. This does change interop, and so the PR also changes the transport parameter code point. So heads up, take a look at the PR if you care, and also heads up that, yeah, this will break interop slowly. Next slide. Another FYI, it was raised, I believe, by Nick Banks, that maybe you don't really need a uint64 to store the ACK eliciting threshold. It's very unlikely that people are going to want to wait billions of packets before sending in an immediate acknowledgement. And so he wanted to potentially limit it to a smaller storage value, and kind of how should that work. So in this case, we said if you can't support a larger value for whatever implementation reason, you must cap the receive value to the largest supported value. And the goal here is just to make the behavior predictable, and to make sure that, you know, people don't do something like, oh, well, that value is larger than like the largest value I support. I'm just going to ignore it, right? Which would obviously be suboptimal. Given, I think, probably the smallest large value you can imagine supporting is something like 255 or, you know, 256. Once we make the other PRs adjustment, I don't really, you know, foresee any issues with this, but figured I'd give people a heads up. Next slide. Okay, so now we have the first of the more complicated issues. So where can the ACK frequency frame appear? And by inference, should the minimum ACK delay transport parameter be remembered for 0RTT? So yeah, the real question is, can it appear in 0RTT? Because that's kind of the one place that plausibly you could try to use it. But yes, you do need to remember the min ACK delay transport parameter in order to make that work. Otherwise, you could accidentally send an invalid ACK frequency frame. Next slide. So let's look at the kind of pros and cons here. So usually we allow frames because Y forbid them, and that's a special case. So that certainly is valid in this case. Maybe there is a tiny reduction of acknowledgements for large client to server 0RTT upload flights. I think this use case is pretty tenuous at best, given IW10, assuming that. And the pros of forbidding it are that max ACK delay is not remembered. So it is consistent with the existing transport parameter from RFC 9000. And our min ACK delay may actually vary by server, platform, OS, and other attributes, which could increase 0RTT rejections. For example, if you're moving from, say, Linux to Windows server, but like both of them support Quic, then that might, you know, cause you to reconfigure your servers in different ways. The editors are recommending that we make it 1RTT only because the utility of ACK frequency and 0RTT is very tenuous, as I said. And we think that the issue with different server platforms and operating systems potentially wanting different min ACK delay is a real issue that we actually think deployments will hit. But thoughts, discussion. There probably are other pros and cons that I did not write down the slide as well. If Jana has any, then he should bring them up.
You have Martin Thompson in the queue. Martin, go ahead.
So I don't think I can implement this recommendation without a massive disruption to the code base. I don't know when we're sending or receiving frames whether they're 0RTT or 1RTT at that level. And so this would be a massive inconvenience. We do have a default value, I think, for the max ACK delay in the case that it's absent, and that would prevent that from being a major problem. So I don't see any problem with just letting people send it in 0 RTT. And yes, that means you'll have to remember min-act delay, but it's not really that difficult to remember.
Yeah, I think the persistence is actually not a big concern. We decided that, as you said, persisting it or not persisting is basically a wash. I think the concern was that the misconfiguration risk of it varying across different locations was a larger concern. So I'm a little bit surprised that it's such an implementation challenge, but yeah, I guess it depends on.
This is a problem with transport parameters generally, though. I mean, if you can't solve that problem for your transport parameters, then you probably have bigger issues. I know this one might be a little bit more unique than others in that certain locations might be tuned differently, but that's you can stick the value that you remember in the ticket and pull it back out again.
Yes.
If I could jump in briefly, Martin, I'd like to hear a little bit more, if you can, about why making this 1 RTT only would be a problem for you. There are frames that we have that are 1 RTT only, and this is one more. Clearly, it's not for you. So I'm trying to understand what the problem is.
So it's very clear in the spec. Well, it's actually kind of not clear in the spec, but there you go. There are a lot of frames that can only be sent in 1 RTT simply by their very nature, like ACT frames. Right. You can't send an ACT frame in 0 RTT because there's nothing to acknowledge. But there are none that expressly forbid 0 RTT sending, and that's what you're looking to do. And so our implementation, I know that others have done the same. It has simply divided frame sending and frame receiving by packet number space packet number space. Not encryption.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
And it's extraordinarily difficult to plumb all of this other stuff through efficiently. And so there's no real harm in remembering the value. The risk is that you send a value that was, I guess, larger than the max ACT delay that you didn't remember. But I don't think that's a problem either, because you can.
Yeah, this is really one that we couldn't find a clear answer for, and I think that honestly, whichever one that the working group wants to go with would probably be fine. The one cons that's mentioned here is, but it's not very clear, is that you could hit a different machine in the server farm when you come up with 0 RTT, and the min-act delay might actually be different on a different host in your server fleet. And
yeah,
again, it's a minor issue. It causes a 0 RTT rejection at best.
Yeah.
At worst.
Yeah, that's it.
So and it's fine. I mean, we deal with that in other cases. So none of these are debilitating, clearly. So the question is, which one do we want to take up? And I'd say that we are fine with either.
I think this is one where I'd like to also just give people more time to think about it and look at the PR, because there may be some gotchas that we are not documenting in this slide that cause us to go one way or the other on this. So I think we would appreciate another few sets of eyes on thinking about this and making sure that we haven't missed some terrible edge case. So, cool. I suspect we will follow back up on this, probably on the list or something, after people have had time to take a look at the PR and the issue more and think about it.
Lori, did you want to say something?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go for it, Corey.
I wondered what was actually being asked. Are you asking to take action on it in the 0 RTT period, or simply just change it in the 0 RTT period?
I think we're asking whether it's legal to send ACK frequency in a packet that is a 0RTT encrypted packet, as well as taking action on it is not. I think it's not a problem. That's not actually true. There is also, I apologize. There is also a race condition that I think potentially gets introduced about whether you apply transport parameters for the ACK frequency frame first.
Yeah.
And John and I talked through that, and I forgot to put that in the slide. And I can't remember, John, did we decide that was resolvable, or is the only way to resolve it basically to buffer all ACK frequency frames until 0RTT? I'm sorry, until the transport params are applied. Do you remember?
I don't. So this is when you receive receive the ACK frequency frame later because of a packet drop, right?
Or transport params are applied later because say you queue a 0RTT packet locally in a local buffer, and then you apply transport params at some later point in time, say due to like handshake offload or something like that. And so you both have a ACK frequency frame that you potentially can process before you apply the transport params.
Ah, right. That was the thing. So, right. I think that we should probably, at this point, we're getting diminishing returns. We should take this back to the thread and discuss and hash this out there. Yeah, and then as Ian said, anybody with more concrete issues, please raise them there, because that will help us make a decision on which way to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next slide. There's at least one more important question I think we want to resolve here. Eliciting an immediate ACK. So the problem here is that you can no longer skip packet numbers, which is kind of the old school trick. If you set ignore order to true, because ignore order means, of course, ignore the order when the packets arrive. And so now there's no real way to get an immediate acknowledgement, short of just sending a lot of packets. So there are a number of ways to solve this problem. So first, we kind of decided that we felt like this draft created this problem, and so it felt right to solve it in this draft. Also, the type of people who are looking at acknowledgement behavior of the sort that ACK frequency provides probably also are interested in this sort of ACK pull mechanism, as well. So the solutions we have at the moment are use an unused bit in the header, which is nice because I'll actually go over the pros and cons in a sec. Use a 1-byte frame, or the other hybrid solution per se that I came up with is to use a 1-byte frame and also offer a stream frame code point that elicits an immediate acknowledgement. And it'll be kind of obvious why that additional frame could potentially be useful, and hopefully in the next slide. So next slide. So the unused bit. Repacketization is very easy. So if you have one packet that's missing and you want to it's a full size packet, you can, repacketize it kind of just the way it was. And you don't have to split a payload or do anything like that. And there's no byte overhead. But there are not very many header bits left. So that is fairly unappealing from that perspective. Next slide. Using a 1-byte frame, call it a Pong, or it doesn't really matter what we call it. Very simple to implement, very simple to understand. We have a lot of frame types that are available even if in the 1-byte land. The major con is this case where you're trying to retransmit previously sent payloads and fit into a single packet. You may end up basically with one trailing byte that you don't know what to do with. It's not the end of the world, but it may make things a little bit awkward in some circumstances. And then option 3 is the frame. Oh, yeah, next slide. Sorry. Adding a stream frame that explicitly fixes that one edge case problem of I have a full size, say like data packet, and I want to retransmit the whole thing, including all the data. It's not as simple, but we have plenty of frame types. That's kind of the negative. So next slide. So our proposal is to add the 1 byte frame now. And evaluate whether the stream frame code point is really worth adding later. I think John and I both felt that using one of the few unused bits in the header would probably run afoul of a whole number of people, including all the people that are trying to deploy lost bits and any other mechanism. But you know, we definitely like input from the working group on this one. Kazuo.
While I think that having a dedicated frame for this purpose is a good idea, I don't necessarily think that it has to be a 1 byte frame. It can be a multi-byte frame. And that's because, if I understand correctly, we are only going to use this frame at the tail, which typically has more than 1 byte of room.
Yeah, I agree. Tail packets almost always have more than 1 byte available. But there is also the other case of like a probe timeout, where you might have kind of a full size packet that worth the data you might want to retransmit. That's kind of the case I was trying to allude to earlier. Kazuo, did you have anything else you wanted to add, or do you want Magnus to go?
Yes, my question is a bit more fundamental here. Is the reordering strictly reordering? I mean, you have this baked in when you skip a number. It's the intentional gaps which you're talking about now that you want to force hacking. You have the packet lost case and the reordering case. All can be hidden in that case. While at the other direction, it's not. It's it's reordering when you have something arrive as a lower number than the highest. But do we actually want to differentiate things when you're hacking? That this direction of going back is okay to skip and not the gaps?
My intuition is no, that like the RFC 9000, we want to treat these all identically. I saw your issue open. Thank you very much, Magnus, for pointing out that we were slightly non-specific in the current draft. I think my intent was to align with RFC 9000 unless there's some reason to change what kind of in order receipt means. But
okay.
Yeah, I think that was just a very slight misspecification.
No, I was just trying to figure out if there's any way of capturing the difference here, because clearly if it's just reordering the other one, it's very simple to just skip over, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd call out about that is I'm not sure if I understand all of the use cases for the ignore order flag, so if other people who have those use cases think that it would be worth breaking out those different circumstances, then I think I'd like to understand those use cases better. Thanks. Christian?
There is that we don't so much send ACK after packets than after flights of packets. There are many implementations that will just drain the receive queue and then say, hey, maybe I should send an ACK now. So how do you reconcile that with the idea that you should stop everything you're doing and send me an ACK?
So I think that's a great question about how this is defined. I was intending that this be defined in such a way that this byte elicits an immediate ACK in the sense of kind of as soon as reasonably possible, but not preclude optimizations such as draining the receive buffer before sending acknowledgements or processing all buffered, like locally buffered packets that are currently undecryptable before sending acknowledgements. So if people think that's the wrong behavior, then they should definitely speak up. But I was intending to not break those optimizations, and I tried to make that clear.
But then if you do that, your spec becomes very, very fuzzy, and you wonder whether that's useful.
So, Christian, if I may jump in here, I think I do want to. I think that's doable in the text and in implementations. We can do something reasonable here, I think, without having to be over prescriptive. We've done this already in the transport draft for ACKs, where we define immediate ACK as roughly that. I mean, not I'm putting quotes, but it's air quotes. We don't actually have that. But I think it's a reasonable thing that we can describe reasonably well. What I'm hoping that we'll get out of this discussion here is a higher order direction as to which one of these three. I think we have preferences, but if the working group wants to go in one direction versus the other, that would be really useful to hear now. I'm not hearing a lot of that on the chat, but if I don't know how to go there, I think it'd be really helpful for us if we knew which of these directions we want to lean towards. Perhaps this is a question for the chairs.
Yeah, I mean, okay.
Matt Lucas.
I mean, from my perspective, it looks like most people are in favor of doing something with either a 1 byte frame or ping, like being the same, also vaguely option 2. But I don't know if we want to, like, doing option 1, I think we should be really, really careful about ever doing that. I think that's probably, because then we're going to have to consider all the other people that are doing things with those bits right now, which we are not. They're not adopted work. And so it's be somewhat unfair to have adopted work just preempt all of that and say, sorry, you can't do anything.
Yep, I think our bias is definitely towards option 2. So in the interest of time, perhaps given that we are out of time, maybe we'll go ahead with option 2. And if anybody wants to push back strongly against that, do it on the issue.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonah. I agree. Okay. I think we've run out of time, right?
Yeah, you're at time, Ian. I know you got a couple more slides, but just in the interest of kind of giving fair due to everyone, take it to the list if you need to drive some input into those things. But thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all the helpful issues, everyone. It definitely improved the quality of the document, or will once everything's merged.
Cool. So next up on the agenda, we had Martin Thompson to talk about greasing the quick bit. Martin, you don't have any slides. I think you are here now. You told me earlier you might not be. I don't know if you've got anything you really want to speak to here. I can see you're participating. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's nothing to say. People have implemented this. I haven't needed to touch it since I put the code points in the document. I think this is ready to go. If anyone disagrees with me, maybe they can disagree with me at a working group last call.
Thanks. Yeah, succinct, to the point. If anyone hasn't read this thing, the draft is also short and succinct. I'd encourage that, and otherwise, as chairs, I think we probably ready to take this to working group last call. So we'll sit on that a little bit and have a chat. But beyond that, thank you. Which gives us some time to get to the as time permits things. So we have a number of slides from Martin Duke. Please get on. I'll start presenting. And these relate to the version negotiation stuff, hence why the presentation is called version negotiation stuff.
Sort of, right? I mean, it's not version negotiations, all the other stuff associated with version numbers. Next slide. So there are a total of 3 drafts in this space that I'm connected to. One is called Quic v2. It has a few purposes, which you can see there. Mainly well, first of all, we've had talk about version greasing and ossification, and a lot of people said we should drop a v2 really quickly. Well, this is a very quick v2. All it is just doing things you're supposed to do in every version, which is rolling new HKDF labels and a new salt, and saying this is a new version. So this is something, you know, so like this is here, we could use it just as a VN working item, or if people really want to have a V2, we can adopt it. The version numbers is a subject of debate whether it's 2 or not. I'll get to that in a minute. Right, so this is that bit is at least pretty straightforward. If it turns out there's any breaking stuff in V1 and we need a vehicle for that, this would be that vehicle. But enough about the draft itself. Next slide. So this has raised a couple of questions that are somewhat aesthetic and somewhat practical. One is just if version numbers are incremental or they're, you know, pseudo-random. I mean, there's an implication that V2 is better than V1 and V3 is better than V2. So do we just take something random from the version space, or do we increment them? So in other words, should this draft be V2 or should it be V-foo? In the interest of time, we can table that to the list, I guess. I think the much more interesting thing is ALPN. I have there an excerpt from a previous version of the applicability draft, which encased a perspective that I think didn't have consensus, but obviously a lot of people agreed in it, which was that the H3 ALPN token was tied specifically to version 1, which in its defense does solve it does simplify version negotiation in that you can typically use alt service for it. It does have some downsides to it. One is kind of aesthetic and practical, in that if you have many versions and many ALPNs, then you're going to just end up with a matrix of all these things, and you will explode the ALPN registry, which is probably not good. A somewhat more practical concern for implementers is, at least in my mental model of the world, quick implementations know the versions they support, and applications provide the ALPN. So either you're binding your applications pretty closely to quick versions and making it hard to retire old versions and bring in new ones, or you're doing something sort of janky where the application provides an ALPN root, and then like Quic applies the version codes that are associated with it. Anyway, that sounds sort of janky and error prone, but anyway, those are the downsides as I see it. A second option that came up when, so in an issue on this document, it's on my personal GitHub, which is listed in the draft. I did a PR to basically not do that, and so there was a comment that maybe they should have to update HTTP3, the HTTP3 draft, to say that, oh, it also applies to this version, which of course potentially could make the HTTP draft just sort of have the front page of it be a gazillion updated bys, which, you know, again, is sort of an aesthetic thing and a little bit difficult. Next slide. So the third option is just to use an IANA registry for this. So there's like 4 flavors of this. They're kind of a bike shed on which one, but you could update the ALPN registry with the Quic versions that it supports, if it does support Quic versions at all. You could edit the Quic version registry to say which ALPNs are supported, or like, again, just as a minor variant to that, you could list the unsupported versions, unsupported ALPNs, kind of the inverse of what you see here. I really don't care which of these you do. Hold a gun to my head, I'd probably say 3B or its inverse. But regardless, next slide. And then the fourth one is not really try to do any of the sort of formal tracing, and just like when people write drafts of new versions and new applications, they just do the best they can with the known versions and applications, which does make the forensics a little harder if you're trying to figure out what ALPNs do. You know, when you're trying to implement stuff, you have to kind of go through, you have to kind of search through a bunch of documents to figure out what's going on. But it does kind of reduce the bureaucratic burden of rolling out versions and or ALPNs. So I'm going to pause. I have another slide about the other 2 drafts, but I do want to pause here and get some comment on if people care about this at all, and if so, what they prefer. Next slide. Sorry, Mike Riley.
So I'll note that previously we did decide ALPN specifically to Quic versions. I remain not wild about that choice, but we did have consensus on it. If we think we want to change that, I really don't like trying to enumerate all the things that are allowed to use a Quic version in the Quic registry. 3A is maybe a little bit better, but what we agreed at the time was that we could just write a very quick draft that says you're allowed to use this ALPN with this Quic version too. I don't know that that necessarily needs to be any new Quic spec, but a really quick thing out of the HTTP working group can expand the scope of the H3 ALPN. Or just try it. I mean, ultimately what it comes down to is, does the Quic version offer the features the application needs? We were hesitant to try and get into defining exactly what those features are and how an application could determine a version offers them, but maybe it's time to bite that bullet and explore how we rate that formally.
So I've been back to the minutes to find this consensus you're referring to, Mike. I will note that after looking at the documents, I'm not sure there's clear text in anything we've adopted or published that really binds that carefully. It combines the ALPN so clearly to a Quic version. In fact, that applicability draft code text that I listed, as Mira mentioned, we actually changed that to be a little more loose about how we resolve this.
2 of H3. HTTP3 relies on Quic version 1 as the underlying transport. The use of other Quic transport versions with H3 may be defined by feature specifications.
Right. So if Quic v2, if the Quic v2 draft exists, has its current language, which is that yes, you can use H3 with this as well. I would argue that meets the text of that.
Yes, some other spec expanding the scope of that would be fine.
Okay, are there other comments about this, or are people indifferent? Martin?
Quic v2 can just say this works for H3. I think that's sufficient. And I think that's really all that you would need to do in your v2 draft, is explicitly say that. I don't necessarily need an updates header for achieving that, nor do I think the updates header is going to end up being crazy, nor do I think that that's a real consideration. So I think this is all going to work out reasonably well just by writing some text.
Okay, that would be proposal number 4. Okay, thank you, Martin. Christian?
Quic v2 that says that it works for pretty much all implementation and do Quic v1. The problem, if we don't do that, is ossification. I mean, if we have to get the approval of each application group before Quic v2 can be deployed, then we have a massive ossification problem. And so we must not be in that position.
Thank you. David?
So my concern, if we don't do anything, is as a client, there are multiple mechanisms that tell me like which LPNs the server supports. So that can be alt service, that can be the HTTPS DNS record. Given those, and if the user wants to browse to that origin, I need to send a first flight of packets, and I'll know, okay, you support HTTP3. I'll know that you support maybe Quic v1, maybe Quic v2, maybe one and not the other, maybe both. And that could lead, if they're compatible, the compatible VN means that we'll be able to go. Actually, compatible VN won't necessarily be good, because if you try one and the server doesn't support it at all, you won't be able to do compatible VNs. So this sounds like it'll race the round trip if we don't have that information tied to the ALPN somewhere or another. Or am I missing something?
No, I mean, that certainly is the drawback, is that you are more likely to end up in version negotiation. That is, I think, why I guess a plurality or a majority or whoever, kind of thought we should tie these things together. And, none of this matters if there's only a couple versions in the long run, but or applications. But if there's many of both, then I think we run into some practical problems.
My take would be, for now, we only have we're going to only have a handful of quick versions, and we're only going to have a handful of applications, or at least in the scope of one use case, like in a browser, when we have one or a few applications. I'd be inclined to fix this, because a round trip is way too much time to be wasting.
So would you say that the V2 draft should then define a new ALPN for H3?
Either that, or we had some other solutions where in alt service you could say which quick versions were supported, for example, and then you would need to do the same in HTTPS DNS records. So I think the simplest would be to define a new ALPN and then move on.
Okay, thank you. No one. So the other question I have on this is, does anyone have any feelings about the disposition of this draft? If we should move forward, drive for adoption, or if it's just nice to go through the exercise and have a target for VN? Is there any enthusiasm to try to adopt this? Okay, hearing none. Next slide, please. So the other draft kind of in this space, well, there's two now. So back at 109, I presented version aliasing. I would say that the feedback was generally pretty positive, with a few concerns. But there was not much feedback after the presentation, on the list and so on. So we did so I did do a little analysis of the fallback mechanism and fix some problems in that. The details are not important right now. Another concern was that, for those of you who weren't there, essentially you get parameters in the first connection and allows you to encrypt the initial, protect the initial and subsequent connections. And people really didn't like that first connection bit. So David Skenazy and I collaborated on a draft called Protected Initials, which takes some bits from encrypted client hello in the TLS group and applies them to the entire Quic initial packet. So there's this chart, which I think is in the Protected Initials introduction, which kind of gives you the pros and cons of each approach and what they do and what they don't do. I would view either ECH Protected Initials, for first connections, and version aliasing for subsequent connections is kind of being a sweet spot. But I welcome you to take a look at these drafts, comment on a list on what you think is useful here versus not useful, and we can proceed from there. Thanks. That's all I have. Thanks, cheers, and everyone else.
Thanks, Martin. I think just with regards to the V2 question, I wouldn't take the lack of response right here as a hard no. I think we just need to do a little bit of thinking about that and relation with how busy other people are with stuff. So yeah, let's chat about that a bit further offline.
Okay. I mean,
beyond that,
I know at times that people express urgency about shipping a V2, and here is something that we could do very quickly if there is that urgency.
And with that, we're nearing the top of the hour. So we did have 2 more talks in the as time permits, and sadly we're out of time for those, I'm afraid. So thank you for your efforts in making those slide decks. People can check that out. It's all on the data tracker. If we'll see if maybe we can get something in the future as well for you, but we'll have to revisit. I'd like to thank everyone for their time and participation on this, especially our minute takers, Watson and Robin. Sounds cool, doesn't it? But I've got some sad news that's occurred during the course of this working group meeting, and that is that our longest serving chair, Lars, is no longer our longest serving. He looks happy, not sad. Zahed, would you like to say something?
Yes, so as Lars, I hope you can hear me. The first time I'm talking in this session. Yeah, Lars wanted to have some more time, more room to do his IETF chair job. So, well, we just allowed him. And actually, nothing much to say. I think everybody in this working group appreciate the guidance, the leadership, and the contribution you did, Lars. And we really thank you for your time. And you will be here as a participant. I'm pretty sure about this. And if we need, we'll bring you back. So thank you.
No, you won't. Thanks all. This is great fun. From the BOF to here, 5 years. It was seriously probably the most fun standardization I've done in the IETF. So thank you all for participating and making this a great group. And with that, we're closing the session. And I'm going to get out of all the Slack channels that I shouldn't be in anymore. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate a big thank you to Lars as well, personally, from being a part of the BOF into coming into the fold of participating in the docs, so then being a chair and having the transition and all of that stuff. So yeah, you'll be missed, and we'll try and do our best to keep the working group flowing.